Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. A Red Bull front row lockout for the Japanese Grand Prix, but lots of storylines elsewhere on the grid. Lewis Hamilton believes that Mercedes, despite on paper an underwhelming qualifying performance in terms of placings, have taken a serious step forward this weekend. He reckons they're only a couple of tweaks away from seriously being able to compete at the front of the field, but also Ferrari today showed in practice the best race pace on the grid, but they will not be starting from the optimal positions. Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I'd greatly appreciate it. First of all, this was a bit of drama going down. If you guys remember last time out in Melbourne, the Alonso-Russell crash-related drama, there was apparently an expectation by the drivers there would be long discussions over this. We saw just yesterday that basically every driver has a different opinion. Some agree with Alonso, some agree with Russell, some say that it should have been penalised, some don't. They were expecting the FIA to discuss this and say, yeah, well, this is what we think, this is why we made that decision, etc, etc. Apparently it was barely mentioned at all. So, yeah, not ideal, maybe. You've got to wonder why that would be the case. This was practice, FP3 of the day, Verstappen, Perez, Russell. Hamilton was P4 as well. The Mercedes is definitely showing more promise. There were other storylines as well, such as Ricciardo having a bit of a spin. That definitely perked the interest, shall we say, of Mr. Liam Lawson, who was there at the circuit. It's very interesting how this is developing right behind the scenes at RB. Tsunoda again out-qualifies Ricciardo today. I'm sure that Liam Lawson is going to be eyeing up that potential race seat in the very near future as well. We've got to talk, though, about Leclerc and Ferrari, because he had another difficult day today, actually, and we'll discuss maybe why that's the case here in a second. Also, though, Ferrari are back at it again. Sure, Ferrari have made strides. Fred Vasseur, I think, is doing a killer job. But let's be real, from an operational perspective, Ferrari still leaves something to be desired. And during practice, Leclerc was like, what are we doing, guys? Why am I in the garage? We've got some time to come on and do some laps. So, you know, I'm sure that that maybe is one part of Ferrari that Hamilton is not especially looking forward to. But there was also discussion after practice on where the cars are, because the feeling was that Red Bull have improved 7/10 on last year on, let's not forget, a circuit where Max Verstappen has absolutely dominated the last couple of years. If there is one car that should be phenomenal around this circuit, it is the Red Bull. But on the evidence of today, every other team pretty much has caught up to Red Bull to some degree over the last 6 months. 6 months ago, Max dominated here. Maybe that's going to be the same story tomorrow. It probably will be. But in terms of qualifying delta, there have been more competitive teams today than was certainly the case 6 months ago. I mean, I'm pretty sure the gap between P1 and P2 in Japan last year would have given you, P1 to P7 or P8 today, maybe even further down than that. It was a much closer qualifying today than we had last time we were in Japan. Different time of the year, different conditions. Maybe the cooler conditions somewhat are helping Mercedes, which we discussed yesterday. But the Ferrari right now a bit of an enigma, and it is kind of strange to me how the Ferrari year on year seems to alter characteristics, right? Because last year and the year before, it was certainly a car that was great in qualifying, couldn't really make that work in the race largely. This year, it seems to be the opposite, whereas the Aston Martin has now gone the other way, where the Aston is now better in qualifying than the race. Alonso says, yeah, did a great quali lap today, but I expect to move backwards tomorrow. And Ferrari feel like the alternative is there. But it's somewhat confusing why they can't quite seem to put together a lap today in qualifying, and let's get into that now. So Russell, I think, got a $5,000, Mercedes did fine for this. Piastri's birthday today, and he did this to him, so, happy birthday to Piastri, but unlucky. But Q1, Zhou, Sargent, Magnussen, Gasly, and Stroll eliminated. So fair play to Ocon getting through to Q2. Sargent, after a tough weekend, goes out again. I think the expectation was that Haas had no shot of making Q2, but Hülkenberg proved their projections wrong. But Stroll, man, this guy is awful at this track. I mean, look at his races, the last odds, qualifying for the last few years here. He had that good race start, didn't he, a couple of years ago here? But his qualifying's are shocking. 19th in 22, 17th in 23, 16th in 24. And it's one of those circuits, like, of any circuit on the calendar, there are probably a few where the driver really does make a difference. We often talk about it in the wets, that, like, the driver can make a big difference there. But certainly Japan is one of those tracks where it feels like the driver can make a bit of a difference, more so than other tracks, just because it's so technical and just so challenging from top to bottom. And this is a circuit where Lance Stroll just tends to struggle, and maybe for reasons such as that. But Q2, Ocon, Albon, Bottas, Hülkenberg, and then Ricciardo. Hülkenberg put on a great lap here again, but the question really was, which one of the two RBs would make it through. They were the strongest of the other teams that aren't typically in the top 10. And again, Yuki Tsunoda makes it to Q3 for the third time in a row. Great to see this happen at his home race, I thought. Only out-qualified Ricciardo, well, I say only, but it was by half a tenth or something, so it was close. But nonetheless, Yuki did enough. He beat Ricciardo's lap time, got through, knocked Ricciardo out in P11. Yuki made it through all the way to Q3, and that puts him 4-0 so far this year in qualifying against Ricciardo. So very impressive stuff. We've got to talk about Q3 as well, because this is when the Mercedes questions started to come to play. Because this weekend, I was genuinely expecting Mercedes to be shocking. What they showed in those high-speed corners back in Jeddah, back in even Australia to some degree, no high-speed performance. That Sector 1, I was convinced Mercedes were going to lose at least 0.6 of a second in Sector 1 to the Red Bull. I thought it was going to be bad. Like they were a backmarker team. Like I think Williams lost maybe 0.9 in Sector 1, something like that compared to the Red Bull. The Mercedes, though, maybe a tenth they lost in Sector 1, which was actually massively different to what they were doing early on in the season. Like, it's massive progress. And even for Mercedes, this was a terrible track for them last season. Like, they came here and got crushed on the Saturday and on the Sunday. And even the year before, that wasn't good either. Even the Hamiltons finished fifth on both occasions last year and the year before. So Mercedes to come here today and actually look reasonably competitive. Yes, the qualifying numbers at the end of the day don't look great, but I think that kind of masks the progress they seem to have made. And Hamilton only tends to say stuff like this when he's pretty happy with the car, because clearly he was happy with the car and he's like, all right, what can I do to try and find this extra half a second? Because, you know, the extra half a second is back in Brackley, right? Like, for them to make some upgrades on the machine. And Hamilton believes that he knows where that performance might be found. But in the end, Verstappen takes pole. It was a close qualifying session between the Red Bulls. Massive credit to Sergio Perez today, because these lap times, by the way, were so much faster than what they were doing last year. I think it's time of year, track conditions, temperatures, this type of stuff that's significantly different to last year, changing the times. But Perez honestly could have had pole here if it wasn't just for like Verstappen being slightly better in the final sector, in the final chicane. Probably Perez could have been there today. And that was very impressive to me, given the fact that he got completely annihilated by Max around this track last year. So Perez and Verstappen looking at the front row. The first time Perez has been on the front row in a very long time, as we'll see in a second. But Norris, P3, 0.3 back. Then Carlos Sainz in P4, 0.5 back. And then it was Leclerc down in P8. I think the qualifying gap last year was something like 0.581 or something. So, you know, that was P1 to P2. So it just shows how much more competitive it was between Sainz, Alonso, Piastri, Hamilton, Leclerc, all here within a tenth of each other. And that's the difference between 4th and 8th. So while it looks today for Leclerc that he had a bad time, which he did, he was only a tenth off Sainz, and that would have been, you know, P4 had he found the extra tenth. But of course, he couldn't, and what a performance again from Sainz. Alonso was maybe my star of the show here in qualifying, to be honest, because on the final runs, there was like nobody could improve. It seemed like maybe the wind had changed or something. Nobody could seem to improve. They were all making mistakes. But Alonso put together, I think, 3 green sectors to improve quite substantially and nearly got to the second row. Yuki was down here in P10, but, you know, very technical track, a real track that absolutely exacerbates the performance deltas of your car. So Red Bull up top, not surprising, but the gap between Verstappen and Perez, and to be fair, Verstappen was like, well, it wasn't my best lap, so, you know, whatever. We get pole, but I wasn't that happy with the lap. And he did say that his tyres were going off towards the end of the lap, and it was the same frustrations Leclerc had, that, well, he was struggling to get the tyres in the right window. Either he started out the lap hot and was good at the start, but then he was really dying in the final sector, or they tried the opposite and he wasn't as good in Sector 1. So Ferrari can't seem to quite get to grips, really, with their qualifying performance of this car at the moment, which is somewhat surprising after what we've seen the last couple of years. But Verstappen now takes his 4th pole in a row, and you'd expect that record to continue for some time, because it doesn't seem like there's any other car capable right now of really competing with Red Bull in the qualifying sessions. But in the race, it actually might be a bit of a different story. We'll see how Perez does, of course, tomorrow, but Marco says that maybe because the contract are now at stake, Perez is turning it around. And compared to how he did last year at Suzuka, which is probably better not talked about, he's obviously had a good turnaround. And we talked yesterday, rumours about Carlos Sainz, rumours about Fernando Alonso potentially joining Red Bull. Makes sense that, you know, Perez is going to try and take a step forward, which it seems like he is. I don't think he was great in Bahrain. I think he was very solid in Jeddah, and then Australia last time out that wasn't particularly impressive either, but who really knows how good that car was because we didn't see what Max did with it. But just when it's become necessary for Perez to turn his performance around, that's what he's doing, right? He had missed front row qualifying results for the last 20 races in a row. So it's been a year since Miami last May when he was on the front row, when he was P1, and of course Max won famously from P9, was P2 on the grid in Belgium after a penalty for Max while having qualified P3. So I think that was the last time that he was even P3. So it's been a bad run of quali for Perez, but when the pressure is on and he needs to deliver, which is right about now and the contracts are getting sorted, turns out that seems to be the case. Quickly on Ferrari, Charles Leclerc was confused as to why he didn't quite have the answers. He had to take a couple of sets of tyres in Q1 that they didn't really want to do because they were, well, he didn't have a good first lap. And discussions here for Mr. Donadoni that actually, yeah, they now realise, Ferrari, that they do have some problems in qualifying to get the temperature right in the tyres. But it's maybe similar, I don't know, maybe it's not similar, but last year's Red Bull had similar kind of characteristics, right, where in qualifying it wouldn't always heat up the front tyres properly. We talked about the anti-dive being a reason for that, but in the race it just had no tyre deg. And Ferrari, at least based on Australia, another front-limited circuit such as Japan, they had good qualifying performance, but they were still, I think, Sainz was, 3/10 off Max in qualifying in Australia, so not massively dissimilar here this time out, but in the race, they were just as fast, if not faster. So I think Ferrari have found something, and it's better to be a faster race car than it is to be a fast qualifying car. The problem is, if you start P4, P5, P6, P7, P8, and you've got, McLarens in front of you that you've got to overtake before you even get to the Red Bulls, then you're running into problems. And Leclerc says, yeah, we've got the pace, just qualifying wasn't really there today. Also, the question is, how representative were the long runs? Because in the long run data on the Friday, the Ferrari was like a second faster than the Red Bull. This morning in FP3, the Ferrari was like a half a second faster than the Red Bull. So, what is this parallel universe we're talking about, where in the race runs, the Ferrari is actually the fastest car over the Red Bull? Now, that's not fully representative because Carlos Sainz says that, as far as he's aware, Red Bull basically run their tanks absolutely full when they do their race runs. So that is absolutely relevant in terms of performance. 10 kg, 0.3 of a second, that's usually what's thrown around. So, if the Ferrari is, let's say, 30, 40 kg lighter than the Red Bull, then that delta in race pace is actually more like the other way around. And Sainz says that realistically here in Japan, it's about fighting for the podium rather than trying to actually challenge further on than that. So still, Ferrari think that they're missing a trick here around this circuit. But even Verstappen said this after qualifying, that not too happy with the long runs in FP3. We weren't as fast as I would like. So there's still a bit of a question mark heading into the Grand Prix. Ferrari looked very comfortable while they weren't that fast over one lap. So yeah, even Verstappen is talking about how, not great balance in FP3, quite a lot of degradation, right? It seems like Red Bull are missing something on these type of circuits. Now, they've still put it a very comfortable P1, P2, and they can probably manage the race quite well. It's tough to overtake around Suzuka, one DRS zone, the dirtier now is greater than ever in these set of regulations. But yeah, it's interesting to see Verstappen not overwhelmingly positive about their performance, and it still feels like Red Bull are somewhat trying to find their footing in terms of how to set up the car for the race. Now, is it possible that Max went for like a full race-based setup and still got pole? Yes, it's actually probably rather likely. But let's talk about Mercedes, because they were the team I thought this weekend that I was expecting to get pretty much crushed, certainly in Sector 1. I thought it would be Red Bull, then McLaren in Sector 1, as it turned out to be, but then I'd have put Ferrari third. But no, Mercedes, and look at the deltas as well. You can really see the performance differences, right? Because Sector 1, the high speed, high downforce required sector really. That's a sector when the top 5 teams are within 0.2 of the Red Bull. Everybody else is half a second back or worse, right? And I thought Mercedes might be down here this weekend, based on what they had said previously. But no, they turn up on the Friday, they have a good setup, they don't mess around with it, and their car actually maintains the performance that it had. This was the question for Mercedes. Why does their car seem to change around so much with different weather conditions? Wasn't really the case. Now look, they were still 0.6 off the Red Bull, but it is a Red Bull that's unbelievable around this particular circuit, and maybe maybe a Red Bull that's better in qualifying this year than it is in the race pace, which is, probably too early to say on that one. But Mercedes 2.5 tenths in Sector 2, 2 tenths in Sector 3, when everybody else was further down. Ferrari had a rough time in Sector 3, which was somewhat surprising, but Mercedes consistently solid car, and sure, on pace they looked like the 4th fastest car overall, but it wasn't far away considering where they were going to be. And this is why Hamilton, maybe surprisingly, but maybe not surprisingly, had a massive grin on his face. This guy was buzzing after the performance, and sure, yes, they were still missing half a second to max, but I think Hamilton understands that given where their car is in the kind of upgrade trajectory or whatever. They've lost so much time messing with their car for the last couple of years. But he says, yeah, I'm excited, more amped up about this, can work from there. It's incredible when the car is where you want it to be, and I can feel exactly where this car is weak. This is a perfect test track, always exposes the limitations. So Hamilton thinks that he knows where the flaws lie, at least the key flaws, and he will feed that back to the Mercedes guys at the factory to try and tell them how to improve their car ASAP. And if there are only a couple of weaknesses they've got to work on, if they get their car performing as they think that it should, then maybe there's something to say about that. Probably too early to say at the end of the day, and it's still P7 and P9, right? I mean, Hamilton outperformed Russell in qualifying today. There's a couple of tenths between them. I think Russell made a mistake on his last run. We'll see that discussed in a second. But yeah, Hamilton says the team did a great job this week, making adjustments to the setup. It's actually the first weekend I've not gone crazy with the setup, and I've not been testing a bunch of things, so I'm back to being more normal. Maybe it shouldn't be a massive surprise. Hamilton stops messing around with the setup, and then, of course, beats Russell in qualifying for the first time this year. I think we got the car to a much nicer working window. Really enjoyable driving, and even watching Hamilton, his performances in the qualifying, especially his qualifying 2 lap that we actually got to see the onboard of and what he was doing the whole lap through. The car looked really stable. He looked very comfortable in the car. We've not really seen that so far. Sure, still a performance delta in the machine itself, but maybe that's not a massive surprise. But they seem to have a greater understanding of it, right? I know exactly where the car isn't strong enough. I can feel it in the car, and I know now to tell them to push in this particular area. Personally believe there's a good direction to go. The weekend, the car's more in a sweet spot, so I hope that continues in the following races, and then they need to underperform. And so he obviously says he's not happy with P7, but we're closer to where we wanted to be, happy with the way the weekend has gone. And last year they were, over a second's deficit to the Red Bull. This year it's more like, he says 7, but it was more like 6 tenths really, 5.8 tenths, whatever it was, for Hamilton behind Max Verstappen, the pole sitter. And he says, yeah, hopefully I've put the car in a good spot for the race tomorrow. So even there's a feeling that Hamilton might have gone for a setup that slightly prioritizes the race. But I feel like, to be honest, nowadays, basically everybody does that. So maybe some signs of optimism here for Mercedes this weekend. I don't think they expected to be especially good here, and I guess we'll see. Tomorrow, I think the weather conditions are going to be somewhat different. It's probably going to be dry, and it's probably going to be warmer. And those are conditions, certainly the warmer conditions, that Mercedes struggled with in Australia. So we'll see if their car, once again, fails to perform, even though it's the same car and the same setup they ran with today and yesterday, pretty much. And just maybe impressive that Mercedes have found a way to actually discover a setup day one that actually worked and they were happy to stick with. And Hamilton's happy to say, all right, you know what, I'm not going to be able to put it on the front row with the performance of the car, but at least I can get out of it what is capable to get out of the car. Russell had a few words as well as to say, like, the low fuel runs apparently exaggerate their problems in the high speed. He feels like they're better in the high speed on the higher fuel runs when they're in the race trim. So, only a tenth and a bit off max in Sector 1, the high speed stuff today. Maybe his feeling is that tomorrow in the race, they can be even more competitive than that. Russell as well was talking about how, it's pretty funny, right? Russell always says this type of stuff, and maybe he's right. But he was apparently 4 tenths up on his delta going into the final sector, but he made a mistake, and therefore he, of course, couldn't improve in the end. But his feeling was that it was going to be super tight between the McLarens, the Aston, the Ferrari, and of course his teammate Hamilton. But yeah, Hamilton got the better of him for the first time this year. This is the grid tomorrow, and it's a rather interesting one. On paper, Verstappen and Perez just drive off, but I'm not sure it's going to be quite that clear if they don't have quite the race performance that maybe they were expecting, at least according to what Verstappen says. Yuki P10, Ricciardo P11, and then from then on down. So very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.